Welcome, Third Rock listeners, to the Branding Laboratory. I'm your host, Devo, Chief Experience Officer for the Brand Storyteller and the Fusion Creative Brands. And each week, I have the privilege of speaking with extraordinary leaders and entrepreneurs who are reshaping the way industries work. These conversations go way beyond the surface to explore the core philosophies, the lessons, and the challenges that define the brands that we admire today. And one of the greatest rewards of this podcast is the opportunity to share the insights of some of the brightest minds in business, people who are passionate about pushing boundaries and redefining what's possible. And as I always say, the stories we tell are the brands we build. And this show is a testament to the power of that concept. Let's dive in. Finding your voice isn't just about speaking and being loud. It's about impact. It's about conviction and knowing exactly who you're called to serve. And today's guest on the Branding Laboratory has built an entire movement around this idea. Her name is Teresa Blaes. I hope I'm saying her last name correctly. I always butcher these last names. But she is an author, she is a podcaster, and she is a faith-driven entrepreneur that is helping ministries and faith-based businesses clarify their message and reach the people that they're meant to serve. That sounds familiar. But like many entrepreneurs, her journey, it wasn't always very clear. And sometimes I question whether I'm on the right trajectory as well. So we're like these chameleons, and we have so many talents and skills that we're always exploring different opportunities. But sometimes we get caught up in that maelstrom of chaos, right? She has navigated self-doubt, brand building struggles. Maybe we can help with some of that today. And the challenge of staying consistent while balancing multiple roles. And I know a lot about that. And I think many of you do who are listening to this podcast because you are entrepreneurs. And if you are an entrepreneur, if you're just anybody in a position of enjoying the podcast and trying to grow and become a better version of yourself every day, and you're struggling to communicate your message and wondering how can you stand out in this sea of sameness, or maybe you're feeling stuck in the inevitable imposter syndrome that always creeps up on all of us, then maybe, just maybe this episode is for you. I think there's a lot of gems that we're going to uncover. So Teresa is going to come on the show today, and she is going to share her highs, her lows of building a brand with purpose, the challenge of marketing in the faith-based space, and what it really takes to find your voice, because it is a process. It doesn't just happen overnight. Like, you've got to play around with things a little bit. By the end of this episode, I hope that you will learn how to get clear on your brand message, especially if you're faith-driven, because I think that is a unique challenge all into itself. The role of storytelling in growing a movement, not just a business, because again, remember, we're people, we're humans. And so our movement starts with this emotional connection we create with our audience. How to overcome imposter syndrome if you're suffering from that, and take really bold action so that you can empower yourself in the process. And the biggest branding and marketing mistakes that Teresa thinks faith-based entrepreneurs make. So we're going to try to cover all of that in today's show. Yeah, it's pretty excited. If you are building something yourself, something meaningful, but struggling to get your message out there, this episode and what I do is for you. I want to shift your perspective and talk a little bit about how we go about things in these deep and meaningful conversations. And if you need some help with this, hit me up, drop me a message. All my contact information here is you can find me on my website, the Brand Laboratory, or look under thebrandstoryteller.com. Let's get into this. So let me start over again. I just got a little sidetracked with that. Today's guest has built her entire career around helping ministries and faith-driven entrepreneurs find their voice and build a brand that creates impact. Very similar to what we're doing over here. So I'm intrigued about this conversation, but she's doing it in a very specific niche-driven industry, and we're going to have some conversations about that. But like many of us, she has struggled, present company included, with how to market authentically. It's why I got into the branding business in the first place, because I had worked with a lot of different marketing companies and I've built multiple businesses. And in every one of those situations, I saw that we were putting the cart before the horse. We were trying to market before we understood our branding, before we understood our messaging, before we understood how we could authentically show up in the world and add some value. And so Teresa had struggled with that early on, and I think she's found her secret sauce. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how to stay consistent, how to brand and market authentically, and how to show up as your powerful, badass self, because that's what people really resonate with. And so let's just get into the show. Teresa, I know you've worked with a lot of countless faith-based businesses and ministries. I want to start with what do you think is the biggest challenge that a faith-based business faces when it comes to branding and marketing? And welcome to the show.
First of all, Devo, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I think that their biggest challenge is being authentic to who they are and sharing the message that God has given them.
I think this word is overly used, and I think I probably dropped it two or three times in the introduction. People always talk about this idea of being authentic, and I fully respect the word and I really love the word, but I think it's gotten so watered down that some people might have lost what it actually means. What does it actually mean to be authentic and genuine in the message and the service and the impact that you're trying to deliver?
It starts with, like, why are you doing what you're doing? If I might give an example, when I first launched one of my flagship shows, the Unresolved Life podcast, I started because I had some questions and I wanted to bring those questions to the mic. It really starts with the why of what you do. I don't care what you're doing. I really don't. I don't care what you do. If you have a reason to do what you do, and it's built out of your faith, because you and I both know, Devo, there is a lot of fake stupidity that goes on online, right?
Yeah.
But if you are a person who loves the Lord, and I'm talking specifically around my audience, if you're a person that loves the Lord, you are committed to seeking His kingdom first, and His righteousness, and all this other stuff will be added to you. Then you don't have to be fake. You don't have to pretend to be something you're not. You can be real. And that, I think, is what a lot of businesses get stuck in, because the world tells you you have to hustle, you have to grind, you got to be something you're not. Even if you're not quite there yet, you got to fake it. And I believe that it starts with knowing what your core message is and who has God created you to be.
So that message that you're delivering right now, this core message, your purpose, your why, this genuine curiosity with how you show up in the world. That doesn't just apply to faith-based businesses. I just want to point that out.
No,
That applies to any entrepreneur. And I appreciate your perspective. I just want to clarify this that what Teresa is saying is not that the only way to have a business is to be operating in this faith-based situation. She's simply saying that whether you're an entrepreneur, Christian, Muslim, whatever it is, faith based, it doesn't matter. The same principles apply. You have to have a genuine curiosity about how you show up in the world, and you have to figure out or want to figure out and spend some time figuring out this why, this purpose, and have a central message around that so that you can connect with the right type of people that appreciate the perspective you're bringing to the table. Is that a fair assessment? You agree with me on that, Teresa?
I would say it is. My biggest, I know who my target market is.
Yeah.
I know who I'm called to serve.
Yeah.
I know in what ways I'm called to serve. When people look at me, they're going to get the real me. I often say, hey, I'm not woke, I'm awake. That people understand that when they deal with me.
Hmm.
Okay. But you have to come to that place for yourself and figure out what is your legitimate why. What is your thing?
You need to get that in the background. You were talking about at the outset of the show in the green room that you were curious about your backdrop being a bit distracting. I want to see a sign that says "I'm not woke, I'm awake" as the backdrop for your podcast. And I'll tell you
I,
what I'm going to do. I'm going to get you a T-shirt printed up so you can start wearing that as a gift for being on the show. How about that?
oh, I'll take it, man. I
You have
honestly,
you have authored several books, you've launched multiple podcasts, you have coached entrepreneurs, you have found your journey, you understand your purpose, you are a very curious individual. I've had a couple conversations with you, and just one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on the show is I just love the energy about your curiosity and your sense of trying to explore things and help other people out. And
mhm.
so I guess I'm just curious, where did this journey start for you? Was there a central defining moment when you knew helping others find their voice was your mission?
Yes, back in 2019, my husband and I were in a hotel room praying. It was around Christmas time, and we were just praying and seeking God because we had a earlier podcast, but it failed, and it failed because we had made a big mistake and we were not targeting, we were trying to reach everybody, therefore we were reaching nobody. And
I'd like to encourage you to reframe that. It wasn't a failure. It was a lesson for you to be able to reframe and reconfigure and come out with a bigger bang. So it
well,
was a
there is that.
it was a catalyst.
Yeah. So we shut that podcast down and it left us going, God, what do you want us to do? What do you want from us? And he basically spoke in our heart and said, my people, I want you to give my people a voice. And so that led to us doing podcast production for clients. That has led to, and doing podcasts for ourselves. Doing a podcast for myself has led to being a published author. And and honestly, I've seen miracles come out of that.
Mm.
I remember one case in particular where I released a show and it was the guest in particular had just lost his mom to suicide.
Mm.
And I could definitely relate to that because my mom either died of opiates or suicide. I don't know which. And so we were having a conversation about around that. And a week later, I get an email, and this lady shared with me her life story. And then she said something I'll never forget to this day. She said, someone shared with me your podcast, and I want to thank you for it. Because of your podcast, I'm not going to kill myself.
Wow, that's powerful.
That.
I love the fact that you've been able to create something that resonates with a very specific audience, and they're so inspired that they take the proactive steps to drop your notes. I would have to say one of the favorite things about podcasting, and I've been doing this for a little over 6 years. Wow, I'm in my seventh year. Holy cow. In my seventh year of podcasting now. And I, like you, have still been trying to tweak with the show and figure it out, but I've developed a nice audience over the last few years. And I
Mm-hmm.
think one of my favorite parts about podcasting is the fact that I get messages from people who listen to the show and were touched by it in some way, shape, or form, or learned from it, or inspired
Mm-hmm.
by it. So I really appreciate that sentiment you just said. You said something earlier, and I don't want to just gloss over it. You were praying with your husband in this hotel room around Christmas in 2019, and you said you had this voice that you received. I'm always curious, and I don't want to go too deep into this, so just try to keep me lined up here.
Mm-hmm.
This voice, because I had a lot of people who have shared different types of stories with me, and whether they're faith-based or not, inspiration or not, they receive this sort of like guiding inner voice that tells them something. What does that sound like exactly to you? Is that sort of in a prayer? Is that in a dream? Is it just a knowing and an intuition? What does that actually feel like to you?
The Bible says that God speaks through dreams, visions, and and then it also says that he speaks through a still small voice.
Mm,
And there are times where I have received all of these dreams or visions. There were times I just get a sense,
mm,
and then there have been times where I know that this was God, it was his voice. I remember one of the first times that I actually heard him for myself for the first time. I was laying on my bed and I heard an almost audible voice. It wasn't audible, but it was loud enough to be audible, and I knew it was not my own voice. And it said, pray for such. And it was a person whom I knew. And when I talked to them the next time, I found out that around the same time that I was commanded to pray, they had gotten in a car accident. The car was totaled, but the entire family walked away without a scratch.
wow.
So, so when you ask, what does that sound like? It can sound like a feeling. It can sound like an impression. To me, the Bible says, "My sheep know my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." And I know the voice of my Father.
You have mentioned a couple of times about launching this Unresolved Life podcast and feeling terrified. What goes through your mind in that sort of space, and how do you push past that fear? I'm always fascinated by how entrepreneurs and business folks and leaders, because we all face fears. I have been in the same boat many times. I'm shifting my business again right now. I've been working on this for the last 8 months, just trying to find that secret sauce. And every time I'm like, I, I find myself often questioning myself. And I wouldn't say it's necessarily fear per se that is motivating my decisions, but I have had those moments. So, what does feeling terrified feel like to you, and how do you get past that?
When I first launched the show, I was launching it out of my own need.
Mm.
I had just come back to God after 5 years of walking away from Him, after losing my mom and my sight in the same week. And I knew I have questions and I'm not going to settle for churchianity answers. And I was actually at Podcast Movement when our business partner at the time suggested, well, why don't you call it the Unresolved Life Podcast? And so we go through the process of setting it up, but I'm thinking, this is a unique show. This is a show around answering some of life's most difficult questions. So I tackle subjects that make the church uncomfortable. And if I have questions, so do others. But will anyone hear me? Will anyone listen to me? Or am I still? And I found a scripture. It was in Psalms 91, I think it was, and it was talking about when terrors surround you at night, the Lord will be your rear guard. If I'm quoting it, I might be wrong. And I knew that was a word for me. And it's get to that place that you know you're called to do something. You have to just say, yes, I'm afraid, and hit publish anyway.
Hmm. Just start by starting. You said you were originally launching the podcast out of your own need. I have to, the question begs to be answered. What's wrong with that? And what's the alternative? Our job, and even in the Bible, there's multiple scriptures around this, if just to reference, to use your own
Mm-hmm.
lexicon, that really talks a lot about people stepping into their power and being fearless and being
Mm-hmm.
courageous and building something.
I don't.
And hold on, let me finish. And that doesn't always necessarily center around not doing it for yourself. I'm just curious, what's wrong with doing something for yourself? And again, what's the alternative?
I in that context, it started out of my own need to understand, to come to a place of resolution, of healing. But it didn't stay there. I believe that if you do something, if you're doing something out of a need that you have, you might do that thing out of your own need, but then when you're going to find as you're doing it, you're going to shift. You're going to shift into a place of serving others. And you may not notice it right away, but then you're going to sit back, especially if you've done it well, and you're going to sit back and you're going, you know what? I started this way, but look where I'm at now. I'm serving my people, the people I'm called to help.
Fair enough. I don't, and again, I'm not questioning that. I think that as business owners, especially if we have a power to give back to the planet, the community, we should come at it from a serve first perspective. But I also would like to clarify, I don't personally think that there's anything wrong with building something out of your own necessity and need. And
Mm-hmm.
in the process of doing such, you learn a lot about yourself. You learn how you can show up in the world, and most importantly, once you've figured that out, you can learn how you can show up for other people. And again, I don't want to get too caught up in the scriptures, but I do know I'm actually quite familiar with the Bible. There are a lot of scriptures that sort of speak to that term. I know
Mm-hmm.
Proverbs chapter 31, for example, they talk specifically about she considers a field and she buys it out of her earnings, and she plants a vineyard and she sets about her work vigorously, and her arms are strong for her tasks, which
Mm-hmm.
really underscores the idea around initiative and resourcefulness and self-sufficiency. Anyhow, next question. I appreciate that. This idea of serving first is front and center in everything that I try to do. And I'm curious, centered around this idea of serving other people, you work with these faith-based entrepreneurs quite frequently. What's the number one mistake they make when they're trying to get their message out? And how are you serving that to clarify that for them?
The number one mistake that I see a lot of entrepreneurs make over and over again is they assume that they're going to build something and then people are going to come.
Mm. The field of dreams.
Yeah. They assume they're going to build it. I've seen this time and again. oh, if I just launch a show, if I just do this, people will just magically show up. No, you got to put a little bit of elbow grease. You got to get some work in. You got to actually market. And there's different ways to make that happen, obviously. But I'm thinking of one individual as I talk, and I don't see where you just put something out there and suddenly people show up. That's not how things work.
Mm. That's like trusting your entire life and winning the lottery, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'd like to add one piece to that because I really appreciate that sentiment, this idea of build it and they will come. And we're referencing the movie Field of Dreams many years ago. I think that there used to be a case for that, so to speak, because the market wasn't so saturated with so many entrepreneurs, right? I imagine that in today's marketplace, you got what, 8 billion people that we can potentially market to. And there's never been a larger group of entrepreneurs working than at this period of time right now that we're aware of, right? At least recorded history. But before that, you could, there were only a few players in the industry. So you could create something. Even if you look at the modern world of social media, if you just rewind 5 years ago, even look how social media has evolved. There weren't so many people doing the same thing. So it's really
Right.
important. So it's really important that you have clarity around what is it that you deliver? What's the problem you're solving? And in the space of problem you're solving, how can I create a unique experience for my client? How can I provide something that is uniquely qualified to solve them or serve them or help them in some way, shape, or form? And then most importantly, be able to articulate that clearly in your messaging. And one of the things that I see a lot, and I'm just curious your opinion on this, is a lot of people will figure this out to some extent, and then they don't realize that it's an iterative process because as they grow and evolve, so does their business and so do the people they work with, right? And so people struggle to stay consistent with this messaging. And whether it's on social media, whether it's on podcasting or marketing like you do, how do you approach the challenge of being iterative, being consistent, and constantly having clarity in your messaging so that you can talk to the right type of people?
I actually, when I first work with a client, I ask them to embrace a concept that I've coined, the suck factor. Okay?
I'm
When you
listening.
first you when you
You
first
got my
start
attention. The
when you
suck,
first
the
start a
suck
show,
factor.
yep. When you first start a show, you first start doing your social media, you first start publishing whatever format you're going to publish, you're going to suck. Okay? That's all there is to it because you don't know what your voice is. You're trying to find your voice, right? You're going to suck. You're going to stumble, you're going to be figuring things out. That's fine. In fact, that's good because you don't want a whole bunch of people right away because you're still trying to find that place where you fit. You're still trying to find that pocket. I had a client, she doesn't podcast anymore, but when we first started with her, I explained this idea and she chewed on it. And then I'm at a conference for podcasting and I got a message and it said, suck number one. Because my belief, and this is what I always tell them, I said, it takes you about, 50 episodes to find your voice. Okay. And she sent me this thing and it was suck number one and it was a video and it was raw and it was ugly and you could tell she was nervous and you could tell she was not didn't have everything figured out, but you know what, it made me smile because I knew, okay, if someone can get past this uncertain, I don't know what I'm doing kind of feeling, and they can start to find their legs and they can start publishing, then they're good. But it starts with embracing, I'm probably gonna suck and that's okay.
Yeah, it is okay. I think a lot of times people forget that this is the process. We live in this society where we have instant gratification at every moment, from
Mm-hmm.
YouTube to social media to being able to have Amazon deliver stuff right to our door in the hour after you've ordered it. Like we have this idea that, and we've been trained, it's crazy. We've been trained away from this critical ideation of understanding that the process is what is where you grow. It's the process where you learn and the process where you're able to develop and articulate and clearly refine what you do. The refiner's fire. We talk about that a lot.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
so it's really important for anyone listening to the show, or whether you're an entrepreneur or doing anything, that you have to invest in the process itself. And I wouldn't focus on so much of the suckiness, as Teresa calls it. I would focus on where in every moment do I have an opportunity to learn from this experience so that I can expand in the process. So I appreciate that sentiment. You said in a previous conversation that your brand messaging could be a little bit clearer. And I find it ironic because you're helping other people clarify their message. And don't think that it's escaped me for a second that even in my own business, in the business of helping other people become better versions of themselves, I often leave myself by the wayside. So,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
sort of.
Yeah.
So that's why I've hired coaches. That's why I have a therapist. I'm like, I need somebody to crack the whip on me every once in a while, right? And so,
Right.
what's been the
Yep.
hardest part for you of refining this brand message?
I am passionate about a lot of things. I love helping faith based entrepreneurs. I love helping the people that God gives me. Okay. But I'm also interested in other things. I have the Unresolved Life podcast, which is I'm actually relaunching because I took a break from it. Because believe it or not, you can get burned out from doing multiple shows. You really can. And so I had to take a break for a little bit and refine and figure out what I'm doing. But I'm bringing back Unresolved. In order to do that, I need to do an upgrade on that. My own website, Teresa Blaes.
Well, hold off. You're getting off tangent for me. Stay focused here
Yep,
for a second.
yep.
What's been the hardest part of you refining your message? So,
Okay, I
and
got you.
you can go a step back, if you will, from just the origin of the business, the origin of the podcast to where you are today. I'm just
Mhm.
curious, as you have evolved into your 50 plus episodes of non-suckiness, what's been the biggest struggle in refining your own brand message?
Um,
And by the way, I'm just using your lexicon, own suckiness. I don't think your
yep,
podcast
yep.
sucks.
I got you.
All right, fair enough.
I when if when we first started, we just did podcast production, but then we've really started like refining. Wait, helping people find their voice doesn't just mean helping them start a podcast. What if they want to write a book, or what if they want to just do social media videos? Um, okay, that's a way to share their voice, but what does that mean for us? Because we're not just now a podcast production company. And so now we are actually going through that rebrand as a company as a whole. And then I'm also looking into getting into speaking. Okay, how does that fit into the main part of what I'm doing? Because I really feel led to do that.
Mm.
So it's crazy. It's like this you're balancing a lot of balls. I'm in the process of writing a book. That book has taken me over 5 years to write for a lot of reasons. And okay, where does that fit into what I'm doing? Because that book is more of a autobiography. So trying to figure out how do you brand it, how do you balance the kingdom entrepreneurship angle that I am passionate about with the angle where in Unresolved I'm going after those hard questions and does it all fit together? It does, but I'm still looking for the link.
Yeah, it's an interesting process, and being able to create and honing in on this most impactful part of least resistance and being able to prioritize what keeps you passionate. And I just wrote this down as you were talking because it's one of the things that I see with a lot of my clients I work with is how do they scale their business while simultaneously juggling a bunch of different things because often we are Swiss Army knives in our own business, right? We're not big corporate conglomerates where we can just pass things off. I would like to add, and I'm getting a little bit off topic, that should be a goal of yours. As a coach and advisor, I tell people find people who can support your vision and your dream and
Mhm.
hand off the minutia and the stuff that you don't that gets in the way so that you can prioritize what really matters most, but really honing in on how you can make the most impact and solve these problems and keep you empowered and passionate, like you said, so that you can quickly scale the business. And so if you are an entrepreneur, if you're listening to the show, it's really important that you take the time to better understand yourself in that role and how your business can show up and be organized and prioritized and not be chasing squirrels down every rabbit hole that pops up or every tree that comes in the way. I appreciate you said that. You help people. One of the things you're doing now is honing in on this idea of replicating what you did through other people. So you're living vicariously through them by helping them launch these faith driven podcasts and brands. What's the key to making sure that a faith based brand actually reaches the people that they're meant to serve? Because it's a very interesting market, and I wouldn't say that it's necessarily the most popular, but being able to figure out how do you help the people you're helping reach their audience that they are meant to serve?
It's a little bit more complicated because sometimes I deal with shows that butt right up against cancel culture.
Mm.
Okay, and so then my issue becomes, okay, I need to help you protect your brand just in case that could never happen here, happens again. You need to make yourself cancel proof. And how do you do that? And oftentimes my concern is not just for the message that they're bringing. God has already given them the message. My job is to bring it to life and help them share it. And how do you do that and still protect their brand in such a way that should big tech decide, you know what, we don't like you on our platform, they better have an alternative.
I want to back up for a second, this cancel culture concept, and I want to just go down a bit of a rabbit hole, and I'm going to cut you off if you go too far. So
Yep.
forgive me in advance. Why? What is this cancel culture? Why has it arisen? Where did it come from? Is there a deeper purpose and meaning behind it? What exactly is the wizard behind the curtain on this one?
I believe
Hey,
it's
remember, and I would like to remind you at the outset of the show, you told me authenticity and genuineness. So I want your candor and honest opinion on this, and don't hold back.
I believe it starts. I'm going to give you two answers. One and more, that is more spiritual, and then one that it's more obvious. Okay, spiritually, I believe that people are deceived. Okay, the enemy loves to brainwash people and deceive them, and you know what? They just don't like you. They don't respect you. They don't like you, and obviously, if they don't like you, they don't need to be speaking. So why don't you just silence them? Okay, that is called deception. In context of what we're seeing today, cancel culture and this woke mentality and all the other stuff that goes with it comes right out of the Marxist playbook.
You're going deep down the rabbit hole. Oh boy, here we go. Give me. Let's not go too far.
I
Just
will just say, yeah,
clarify what you mean by that. The Marxist
okay.
playbook.
If you actually look at what the Soviet Union did, what communist China has done, what a lot of these oppressive countries have done, what is the first thing they do when they come in? They silence the opposition. Okay, that is one of the first things that they have to do. They got to silence the opposition, and often they silence the churches, or they tell them, sure, you can still stick around, but you better modify your doctrine to fit what we want.
Okay, so you're saying that this is a much larger conspiratorial reason, and I don't use the word conspiracy theorist, conspiratorial reason that this is going on, and we're not going to go into that. So I
No,
hear that.
no.
But why are faith-based people under attack? What is it about faith-based people that you think are the centrifugal figures of the ones being blocked and attacked? What is that? What does that actually mean in the more esoteric, broader sense? So, maybe a better way to phrase that question, faith-based people represent what for the people that are trying to silence them?
They are a threat.
Why?
Who's God? Is the Lord God or is government God?
Mm.
And if government is God, then that by nature, that means you cannot by nature worship any other entity but government. If God is God, then that means that He alone is God, and that means you cannot worship government because He said, you will have no other gods before me.
Okay, fair enough. I accept and respect your answer. So, how do you, in your secret sauce of advising and counseling these entrepreneurs, teach them, instruct them, advise them how to become cancel proof given all of that?
First of all, you got to have your own platform. Have to, have to. You must have your own platform where you can have your content, and you got to have backups upon backups. And the other thing you have to do is,
Wait,
okay,
hold on. I want to stop you there. What do you mean by their own platform? They need to have their own website. They need to have their own show because all that still has to go through the corporate giants that you referenced earlier, whether it's Google or Facebook or anything else. What does that mean, have their own platform?
so I believe you got to have your own website.
Got it.
Uh, and then I also think, and we're actually moving into this, if you're doing a podcast, I think you need to have your own app. Because if Google or Apple decides to pull you out of the iTunes store, then you need a place where they can download your app, have it on their phone, and be able to get access to your stuff.
So how are you helping people with app development? Do you have your own
Yep.
programmers, or how does that process work? You actually have
Yeah, no, yeah,
you,
we're
you
actually,
actually have tools and resources for that?
yes, I do.
That's amazing. I'd like to learn a little bit more about that actually, if you don't mind.
Yeah, we could definitely talk about that.
Interesting. Okay, have your own app, have your own resources, have your own website, have your own autonomy is what I hear you saying. That's basically the
Mm-hmm.
crux of
That,
that
yeah, have your
conversation.
own autonomy. And then also, there is such a thing as the alternative economy. And so, what is happening is because cancel culture cropped up and started messing things over, for example, YouTube is known for cancel culture. They are big on messing things up.
Oh, so
Okay.
go back to this alternative currency. What are you saying? What's that part?
Alternative economy.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
What does that mean? Explain.
So, for example, like I said, YouTube is big for cancel culture. There is a platform called Rumble, and their
Got it.
biggest thing is we are not going to cancel you. We will allow free speech on our platform.
Understood. So work with people that are outside of the context of obviously the ones that are showing down. That seems obvious, but I don't know that people know that there are other ways to operate outside of YouTube and Facebook
Mm-hmm.
and the big giants.
Exactly.
But there are other ways, and so you help them discover and unpack what those other ways look like, right?
Correct.
Something I see a lot in my business is, especially with purpose-driven brands, is that they're very passionate about their mission, but they're hesitant to market themselves. And we talked about this earlier. Both of us are guilty of that. What advice would you give to entrepreneurs, even like myself, who feel like marketing can be too salesy or narcissistic or self-promotional? And a lot of faith-based businesses might fall into that category because whether they're more humble or they think that they shouldn't be gloating or goading, all those sorts of things. So, what would you say about that?
If you have a product or service that you feel can help someone, then you have a moral obligation to sell it.
Hmm.
You have a moral obligation. I'm not saying be salesy or sleazy. I hate that stuff. I really do. If you look at the Bible, okay, and you look how Jesus operated, how did he operate? How did he share his message? He picked 12 guys that kind of turned the world upside down. Okay, you need to decide, okay, I'm going to share my message. That's all I'm going to do. I just want to help people. I'm going to share my message. This isn't about me being salesy. This isn't about me being a car. You're not trying to come at people like the typical used car salesman, right? You're trying to come at them. Hey, you have a problem? Let me. I would love to help you. Here's how.
The piece about the moral obligation really resonates with me because I think you and I must have been together in a previous life because we've had similar conversations with similar people. But I tell people the same thing in that capacity is that if you have something that can educate, inspire,
Hmm.
motivate, people entertain, if you have a gift or an idea or a thought, I'm not saying to give your idea away. I'm saying to use your idea, use your gift to help other people, even if it's one person, because those one person can become two persons, et cetera. And through the compound concept, you grow. That's how you grow an audience, right? But you do have a moral obligation, in my opinion, as a human in a community-based planet that we live, to share that gift with other people. And I couldn't agree more. A lot of faith-based businesses, and I know several people in this industry. I've worked with a few people in your space. They feel like and this doesn't just apply to faith-based people, by the way. This applies to everybody. I think a lot of people. Let me back up. I think a lot of entrepreneurs, especially as it pertains to social media or their email newsletter or their website or whatever it is, feel like they need to have a really massive audience to make an impact. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I think, like we just said, it's important and your prerogative to just start with one, affect one
Hmm.
person. That doesn't mean forcing your will upon them. That just means sharing this message in a way that they can consume it and act upon it and be entertained, educated, inspired, yada, yada, yada. What is your take on that whole idea of you have to have a big audience in order to make an impact?
In the context of podcasting, I'm going to step into that for a minute. I believe podcasting is the most intimate form of communication that you can have with your audience because they are choosing to put you in their ears and you are getting up on a stage and you're speaking to one person.
Mhm. I love
Okay.
that.
And you don't know what's going to happen. I didn't know that when I released my first episode of Unresolved that it was going to reach one person and it would stop them from killing themselves. I didn't know that because of my show, I was going to end up a published author, a book that shared my personal story. I didn't know any of that. I just stepped out and said, okay, yes. I'm willing to give you my yes, Father.
Hmm.
And I shared. And if one person hears and is changed because of something you said, something you did, that's a win.
Yeah. Focus less on the numbers and focus on building trust and opening doors for communication and potentially future collaboration. And what happens again, I like small audiences from the standpoint of this is an audience that I built over time, going back to that conversation of process that we talked about earlier. This isn't something that, and here's a really cool analogy if I'd like to share with you for a minute. I always love the sort of telling the story of the individual who walks into a bar and he's a musician or she's a musician, and there's a few people in the bar initially to listen to their music, right? So they're performing for a small crowd at a small bar. And within that bar itself, into that smaller microcosm, not everybody in that band in that audience is necessarily going to fall in love with this individual's music, right? But somebody potentially will like it. There's probably a good chance that at least 50% of the people in that room will enjoy your music, assuming you have some modicum of talent. And what happens is those 50%, let's say there's 10 people in the bar. 5 people you really resonated with your music. Five
Mm-hmm.
people went to Spotify or Apple to download another song. 5 people looked you up on social media. 5 people started following you. 5 people started going home and sharing that message with their audience and telling, hey, you know what I did last night? I saw this really cool artist, Teresa Blaes. She was in there playing the guitar, and holy man, she just fucked shit up. It was an amazing song. And that's how you build an audience of trust and community and collaboration. So the small audience does matter. It
Yes, it
matters
does.
more. It matters more in some cases than having a larger audience because you have a greater ability to connect. Like you just said, Teresa, I love that. I was like, give me the high five. It allows you the opportunity to connect with